Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we're talking to author Marcia Hensley about her journey to Wyoming and her book, Staking Her Claim, Women Homesteading the West. Welcome, Marcia.
Well, thank you for having me.
I noticed in your bio that you grew up in Missouri, and then it sounds like you spent most of your growing up years in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Kind of started my westward journey with a little southern loop there in Tulsa. But yeah, I went to, all my schooling was in Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma and at the University of Tulsa. And I always, even then, and as a child, I had a real fascination about the West. But the Tulsa that I lived in, the Oklahoma part, was not really very West. It was more influenced by Southern values, kind of a Bible Belt area. But it was a good place to be, and I grew up a happy childhood and got a good education.
And so what was your intrigue with Wyoming?
Well, when I was in college, like I said, I've always been sort of interested in the West, or even as a child, I guess, through Western movies. But when I was in college, I had an opportunity to work in Yellowstone National Park one summer. And that just began my fascination with Wyoming, especially. I just was very taken with the atmosphere, with the landscape, of course. And basically, I just fell in love with Wyoming, and I always hoped, it was like, well, it was this dreamscape that maybe someday I might be able to return to, but it didn't seem very possible. So I went back home after the summer, finished my senior year, got married, started on the expected trajectory of having kids, married and having kids and teaching school and just being the good wife that was expected in the 1960s. And then in the 70s, we began to open up things with the women's liberation movement, people beginning to think about women's rights and not only their rights, but also that women had been suppressed in ways that were not necessary. Women taking chances now and taking on more adventuresome roles.
Well, it sounds like you were really intrigued about women and homesteading and that pioneer spirit of a woman. And so how did that influence you? What was it that drew your attention to the pioneer woman?
Well, when I had a really wonderful opportunity. I had divorced and I had an opportunity to teach at Western Wyoming Community College in Rock Springs. While I was there, one of my colleagues said, you really ought to read this book called Letters of a Woman Homesteader. She said, her experience reminds me of yours. And Eleanor Pruitt Stewart came out to Homestead in the early 1900s in Burnt Fork, Wyoming, which is close to Rock Springs. And she came out as a single woman or as a widowed woman with one child. And I came out as a divorced woman with two daughters. And it did really resonate with me. But what happened was I was trying to get to know my new environment in Wyoming. So I took a history class, Western history class. And in our textbook, the authors said that women were reluctant pioneers. And I had just read Eleanor Pruitt Stewart. So it was like, well, wait a minute, Eleanor was certainly not reluctant at all. And so this disparity between what the historians were saying about women coming west and what I was reading about Eleanor and what I was experiencing, really, although it was in the 1980s, 75 years after Eleanor, I just thought, I don't believe that, or at least I question that. And so that started me researching Were there any other women who did homestead alone as a single woman? And if so, did they write about that? And if so, what did they say? What was it about? So that started me on this research project, just sort of informally, just out of my own curiosity, that eventually turned into a book.
Yeah, and it's won many awards. I think about what is it that resonates with pioneer women and women living today, right now. What do you think are the connections there?
Well, I think it's the adventuresome spirit. I think you admire that kind of adventuresome spirit, and I think it takes that kind of adventuresome spirit, no matter what walk of life you're in, to have a fulfilling life. I think that just amazement at the hardships that they've gone through and overcome. Women homesteaders, they came west out of a sense of adventure, but also out of a sense of opportunity. They felt their lives could be made better in the West, and that certainly was what brought me here. And they also had to have some sort of affection for this landscape, which is, when even in the 1980s, when I came here from Oklahoma, it had a sort of frontier feel to it. And you have to have a certain kind of interest and curiosity about a life and willingness to maybe endure some difficult times that you wouldn't have if you'd stayed at home.
What have you learned about yourself and what have you passed on to your daughters about being a single woman?
Well, I feel like I have learned a lot about myself. Coming to Wyoming, I felt empowered by the environment and by the kind of people who were here. They never questioned my ability to do anything and often gave me opportunities to grow. So I think it's important to believe in yourself. And so I learned that through many, many different things that have happened. And I feel like I have taught my daughters to listen to their inner voice and to follow it. And oftentimes when you do that, it leads you in the right direction, and it leads you, even though you can't anticipate exactly what that might be. From my experience, to illustrate that, the coming west had this fascination with Wyoming, and I found myself at a conference in Michigan, of all places, where I met a person who's from Western Wyoming College, and in conversation learned that they had an opening for an English teacher. And so I followed that. I followed my heart there. I didn't know what was going to happen, but if you know what direction you're following, sometimes opportunities will arise. And I think it's important to take those opportunities and go with them. And I think that is something I hope I have taught my own daughters, and I think I have. And I would tell any young woman that would be my advice.
Do you have an opportunity to mentor young women?
Well, actually, yes. Of course, I taught at the college. I taught English at the college for many, many years. I've always been a teacher. And so I hope that by being a role model for them, to see that here is this single woman and here's what she did, although she did eventually marry, which I did. But I think mentoring is important. I think just telling the stories of women who have succeeded. And that's one of the things I hope that my book has done, is to tell these stories that had not been common knowledge about single women homesteading alone. They are such an inspiration for what a woman can do if she sets her mind to it. And so I think I've been interested in women's stories all along. As I wrote the book, I've been doing oral histories. I think the oral histories of women and their experiences, I was especially interested in those stories of women who came west alone. Also, what you're doing now, I think it's so important to get those stories out there, because stories can be so powerful influence on people.
Tell me about one of your favorite stories, your favorite characters, and their life experience that inspired you in your book.
One of my favorites is a woman named Florence Blake Smith. She homesteaded near Wright, Wyoming, which is near Gillette. And this was in the early, I think, I can't remember the exact date, maybe about 1908, something like that. So she had grown up in Chicago. Her family had no farming background. She was actually a bookkeeper for the Federal Reserve living in Chicago. She ran into a young man she'd gone to college with or high school with who had just come back from homesteading in Wyoming. And he was telling her all about it and how enthusiastic he was about it. It's his future there. And she writes that she thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it too. And one of the significant things is that you could homestead, women could homestead by themselves because if they were unmarried, they were considered a head of household. So she realized that she could do that, legally do it. And she did with absolutely no idea what she was getting into, really. But she read up on it and she had a wonderful time. She ended up writing a book called Cow Chips and Cactus about her experience, which is now out of print, but parts of it are printed in my book. And she was very successful and she loved it. She had a wonderful time doing it. And she did prove up. And it meant a lot to her to have that land in the family. Even though she went ahead and remarried after a time, a man that she met in Wyoming, and continued to live in Wyoming the rest of her life.
What do you think are some of the challenges for women living in Wyoming today to make it in business and politics? Do you think there are some obstacles?
Well, I've thought a lot about your question about that. I did not face obstacles in teaching, in my teaching career much. So I don't know that I can speak directly to the experiences of women in business here. I think in general, the attitude toward women in Wyoming is very open and very, what I experienced was always, if I had an idea, I was encouraged to go for it, to pursue that. And I would hope that is true for most women. I'm sure that there are some obstacles, but for me, the only obstacle I ever had was, in my career, I felt, was when I was trying to get my book published. And it's hard for anyone to publish a book, but I did feel like some of the publishers I approached, many of the people on the board were masculine, and they didn't appreciate some of the things that I was pointing out in my book about women being kind of the stories of women homesteaders being neglected in the mainstream histories of the West. So they rejected that. So it was ultimately a woman publisher, High Plains Press in Wyoming, who accepted my book. And that was a great fit. But that's the main place I felt I have seen an obstacle. Otherwise, I think it's been very open.
Do you think that books about history that young people can relate to, do they find it fascinating? What's some of the feedback that you've gotten from your students regarding women and history, and is it interesting to them?
Well, it is some of them. I just recently had a young woman in Nebraska contact me because she'd read my book, and she was writing a paper for one of her English classes about women homesteaders because she'd read my book. So, yeah, I think it does. And I was thrilled when that happened because, you don't know. You write a book and you put it out there and you hope that it makes a difference. And at least for that young woman, that's very recent, it has made a difference. And when I was still teaching at the college level, that also, and I told my students about what I was doing, although I wasn't writing the book at that time. I had started the research. And I think it has always resonated with any woman, especially in the West, maybe not Easterners. I don't know. I think the Easterners are pretty interested in what goes on out here also.
Do you ever make any kind of comparisons between the women who pioneered in the West and what has happened today, like, for example, with the #MeToo movement? the dangers of being by yourself, the dangers of men taking advantage of women. Is any of that touched on in your book back then?
You know, the women homesteaders, that's really an interesting question. Most of the things that they wrote, and my book is based on what they wrote, both a collection of the things they wrote. There was never any mention. Well, there was one mention one time of a woman who felt a little bit worried out on her lonely homestead because there had been a vagrant man in the area. And so at night she would stack things in front of her door and make sure so that nobody could get in. And she was a little worried. Now, whether or not they only wrote about positive things instead of negative things, which I think is possible, because sometimes they were writing for magazines and sometimes they were writing home letters that they wouldn't want to worry people. But as far as actually finding evidence of that in their writing, I did not, except for that one thing. Now, I'm sure that there were rough characters, but these women, apparently, these are the women who succeeded. That's another thing about my book. I did not find failure stories. And if women had a bad experience, they didn't write about it. And I think that those things could have happened, but they didn't want to talk about it.
I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and so that could be, it could relate to the Me Too thing now because women are talking about it. I mean, there's always been that reluctance up until now for a woman to say, oh, well, maybe I unintentionally encouraged this, or, the various pressures that women have felt over the years. And now women have been given a voice or have taken the opportunity to, or felt it needed to be done. And it has, although I do think that sometimes the Me Too has gone a little too far in destroying the careers of men who, certainly not the Harvey Weinsteins, but there have been some kind of otherwise honorable and good men whose lives have been pretty much destroyed as a result of that. And I don't quite know how to resolve that in my own mind, but
right,
there is that.
That's true. There is that. So what wisdom are you imparting to young women whenever you can? What would be your piece of advice for a young woman growing up today and the challenges that maybe they're facing or not facing, but how do you think you can inspire them?
Yeah. Well, I think what I would say is to listen to your own inner voice and follow it to the best of your ability. I've always liked the phrase, be the change you want to see in the world. And I think that can happen. Like I had said before, if you are open to the opportunities that arise in your life and you say, yes, I can do that. Yes, I'll try that. When opportunities come, take them. And I think that would be my one main advice that I would give.
Well, thanks, Marcia. It's been great talking to you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwhy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the equality state. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.